I am without bread and cannot get any. My children will starve, or if they do not, they must freeze. We have no wood, neither can we get any. Pray come home. An American soldier's wife.
By 1780, America was in the 5th year of its war for independence, and tens of thousands of families were torn apart. Women were running farms and shops alone. Children were growing up without their fathers. Farms had been ravaged, livestock and crops had gone to feed the armies, and the currency of the land was almost worthless. 5 years after it was issued, a continental dollar was worth about a penny. In Philadelphia, beef cost 15 times what it had a year before. An ordinary horse sold for $20,000. A wagon load of money, wrote George Washington, will scarcely purchase a wagon load of provision. Some Americans, however, were benefiting from the war. Profiteering was rampant. The hero of Saratoga, Benedict Arnold, used public wagons to transport his private stockpile of imported goods to market. He was accused of closing down rival shops, forcing people to buy his goods. Even members of Congress stood accused of lining their pockets.
If I were called upon to draw a picture of the times and of men, I should say that idleness, dissipation, extravagance seems to have laid hold of most of them. An insatiable thirst for riches seems to have got the better of every order of men. George Washington.
There sets in a period, a whole era of the revolution, in which it seems as though there is not going to be a future. The American people are suffering cruelly from want and from despair, and they are weary of this war. This is a situation in which many people are saying, how could we have been so foolish as ever to have believed that we could have taken on and licked the most powerful empire in the world?
America's war weariness was mirrored in England. The ordinary Englishman had never been for the war in the first place. To make matters worse, the war was doubling Britain's debts and wrecking her economy. To end the war, the King's ministers put forward a promising new plan, taking the American South. Savannah, Georgia had already fallen to the British the year before. American loyalists assured the Crown that unlike troublesome New England, the South was teeming with subjects ready to take up arms for the King.
The British government believed that the American Revolution was the work of a small group of malcontents, largely located in New England, and that on the whole, the American populace was loyal to the Crown.
But the Crown had failed to defeat the revolution in New England and the Middle Colonies. Now victory depended on taking the South. In New York, British General Henry Clinton recognized the magnitude of his mission.
I felt the tottering ground on which I stood. This is the most important hour Britain ever knew. If we lose, we shall never see such another.
Clinton sailed with 100 ships and 8,500 men. His objective was the largest and wealthiest city south of Philadelphia, the jewel of the South, Charleston. Perched on a peninsula, Charleston easily could be cut off. Against Clinton's impressive force, the American general Benjamin Lincoln had only half as many men. The British began digging in for a siege. After 19 days, trapped by the Royal Army and blockaded by the Royal Navy, Lincoln called a council of war to discuss a withdrawal. The city fathers were vehemently opposed.
Some declared to General Lincoln that if he attempted to withdraw the troops, they would cut up his boats and open the gates to the enemies. This put a stop to all thoughts of an evacuation. General William Moultrie.
On May 9th, a furious cannonade would erupt between the two armies. Mortar shells crossed and exploded long into the night. General Moultrie observed it appeared as if the stars were falling to the earth. The constant pounding took its toll.
Fatigue was so great that, for want of sleep, many faces were so swelled that they could scarcely see out of their eyes. William Moultrie.
3 days later, surrounded and cut off from help, Lincoln finally surrendered. Clinton's terms were humiliating.
Lincoln is told, "You will be denied the honors of war." He cannot march out with his flags flying and his drums beating. This is an important thing in 18th century military behavior.
At 11 o'clock in the morning of May 12th, the Continentals laid down their muskets. Charleston was the worst rebel defeat of the Revolution. 5,466 Americans, including General Lincoln, became prisoners of war. It was America's largest surrender to a foreign army until the fall of Bataan in World War II.
The soldiers captured at Charleston were crowded into prison ships and other loathsome quarters. Nearly 1/3 died. Their hardships were not alleviated by civilities from their conquerors. Dr. David Ramsey.
Get back here!
During the Revolution, 18,000 Americans were taken prisoner. Almost half died. To survive, men fought each other for rotten morsels. From their hair and rags, they picked lice and vermin and ate them. Rats were a delicacy. Scurvy, smallpox, and yellow fever were epidemic.
The foul atmosphere and sickening heat, the shrieks and wailings of the wounded, the struggles and groans of the dying, altogether formed a combination of horrors which no pen can describe. Thomas String.
In the end, more patriots died in British prisons than on American battlefields. By 1780, the Americans had taken more than 9,000 prisoners, but they lacked the experience, the jails, and the manpower to hold them. Many simply wandered away. The rebels' treatment of loyalists was a different matter.
In Kingston, New York, Loyalist prisoners were entombed, in essence, in a subterranean cellar underneath the building where the Provincial Congress of New York met. It was so overcrowded and it was so filthy that the smell rose through the floors and permeated the meeting room in which the Provincial Congress was meeting.
The stench was so terrible that a resolution was passed permitting congressmen to smoke. As the resolution read, for the preservation of their health.
Charleston has fallen. I fear the whole country goes with it. For having nothing but a few discontented militia to depend on, we shall never be in any condition to check the ravages of a merciless enemy. John Matthews, Continental Congress.
After capturing Charleston, General Henry Clinton returned to his headquarters in New York. His second-in-command, Charles Lord Cornwallis, remained behind to roll up the rest of the South. In May of 1780, he was on the move in South Carolina when he learned that a small rebel force was 10 days' march away. Encumbered by his army, Cornwallis knew he could never catch up to the rebels. So he sent an ambitious 27-year-old lieutenant colonel in pursuit.
Bannister Tarleton, who was this young buck. You know, he's one of these kind of flashy Errol Flynn characters you always get in warfare. And he was only good up to a certain point because he was so hot-blooded, he got himself into trouble.
Tarleton and his men covered 105 miles in 54 hours. On May 29th, they caught Colonel Abraham Buford's column of 300 Virginians on flat ground with no cover.
Tarleton, his infantry and cavalry advanced to the charge with the horrid yells of infuriated demons. Buford ordered a flag to be hoisted, expecting the treatment sanctioned by civilized warfare. This was no part of Tarleton's creed. Dr. Robert Brownfield.
When an American raised a white flag, Tarleton personally cut him down. In the end, not one rebel was left standing. For Tarleton's deeds that day, the red-haired firebrand became a British hero. But in America, his name became synonymous with barbarity. The term Tarleton's Quarter came to mean, take no prisoners. To replace the men lost at Charleston, a new American army was marching south with a new commander, General Horatio Gates. Washington opposed the choice. Gates was more an administrator than a fighter. Congress hailed Gates as the victor of Saratoga and gave him the command.
Gates arrived in July in South Carolina to encounter troops that were already in terrible condition, hungry, and many of them ill, and announced, much to the surprise of the officers and the dismay of the soldiers, that he intended to take them on a march almost immediately.
For his first Southern offensive, Gates targeted Camden, South Carolina. Held, he was told, by only 700 men. Against all advice, he ordered the march by the shortest route, straight through barren country.
To the men's complaints and queries, he responded reassuringly that, in fact, there would be supplies, rations, rum along the route. There wasn't. They were so desperate and so hungry that they took hair powder that was used for their hair and mixed it in to thicken the stew that was made out of stringy beef, green corn, and hair powder.
Sick and underfed, the troops took 2 weeks to cover 120 miles. The night before the attack, Gates treated his men to rations of molasses in place of the rum he had promised but didn't have. Among the already weakened troops, the molasses caused crippling diarrhea. When Lord Cornwallis heard of Gates' approach, he marched his army north to confront the rebels. On August 15th, the two armies collided in the night. The next morning, before the fighting resumed, Gates deployed the unseasoned militia on his left and center, and on the right, the veteran Delaware and Maryland Brigade, under the Bavarian volunteer Johann de Kalb.
He is, like Washington, a physically commanding guy. He's a big man, and he's got bravery out the kazoo. This guy is afraid of nothing. De Kalb gets here, and Washington immediately recognizes this man is a real soldier. He's got a good head about him. He's an excellent commander, and his troops really like him. So de Kalb is given command of the Maryland Division, and he turns it into a crack fighting force.
But Gates didn't send in de Kalb's veterans. Instead, he dispatched the inexperienced militia. The British seized the moment.
The impetuosity with which they advanced, firing and huzzaing, threw the militia into such a panic that they threw down their loaded arms and fled, a great majority without firing a shot. Colonel Otto Williams.
I confess, I was amongst the first that fled. Cause I cannot tell, except everyone I saw was about to do the same. It was instantaneous. There's no effort to rally, no encouragement to fight. Officers and men joined in the flight. I threw away my gun. An American militiaman.
Within minutes, 2,500 men, 4/5 of the American army, ran away. Only one militia regiment and de Kalb's Maryland and Delaware veterans stayed on the field. With a valiant counterattack, they drove the British back until Cornwallis turned his entire force upon them. Outnumbered more than 3-1, de Kalb continued the fight. First with bayonets, then hand-to-hand.
So de Kalb leads his division from the front. It's a follow-me type of leadership. I'll ask you to do nothing I'm not prepared to do first myself. He stands and fights, and he refuses to surrender. Wounded multiple times, and then he's bayoneted to death.
De Kalb's men now fled with the rest of the army, chased by Tarleton's cavalry. He hounded the rebels for 22 miles and quit only when his horses were exhausted. When the militiamen ran from the field, General Gates rode past them, all the way out of the state, and kept on going. He never fought another battle.
What do you think of this great man? Was there ever an instance of a general running away, as Gates has done, from his whole army? 180 miles in 3 days and a half. It does admirable credit to a man at his time of life. Alexander Hamilton.
In 3 months, America had lost 2 armies and suffered 2 of its worst defeats. hopes of Southern rebels would now depend on a different kind of soldier, waging a different kind of war. The private armies of a handful of charismatic leaders, the mysterious men known as the partisans. After the British triumphs at Charleston and Camden, the British strategy of winning the war from the south up seemed invincible. In the summer of 1780, hundreds of loyalists flocked to the British lines to enlist. They were even joined by some of their former enemies, nervous patriots ready to return their allegiance to the crown. Even a former president of the Continental Congress switched sides. Georgia now had more men willing to fight for George III than for George Washington. General Cornwallis held the southeastern coast from Savannah to Charleston. With no American army left in the South, Cornwallis confidently moved inland to set up a chain of forts.
The British, as they move further and further north, getting away from Charleston, getting away from Savannah, they create what are called lines of communications, these long supply lines. Now, you can get food locally, but you can't get ammunition locally. You can't get all those other things that armies need to function. So supply trains have to be organized, convoys have to be run. Once you do that, you've created a target. And that's what the Americans will do. They'll go after those targets, the soft things, the depots, the convoys, those small outposts, and they'll try to bleed the British to death that way.
The greatest threat to British supply lines came from the bands of guerrilla fighters called partisans. One of their most aggressive leaders was the wealthy planter Thomas Sumter. At the news of Charleston's fall, he rode off to fight the British. Hours later, Vanastra Tarleton burned his plantation to the ground. Sumter raised his own guerrilla army and fought more than a dozen battles against the British and Loyalists. The fierce partisan was known as the Carolina Gamecock.
He was not over-scrupulous as a soldier. Enchanted with the splendor of victory, he would wade through torrents of blood to achieve it. Colonel Henry Lee.
When British-born lawyer William Davey heard of Charleston's surrender, he immediately left his practice and sold his considerable estate in North Carolina to fund his own guerrilla army. At Charlotte, with only 150 men, Davey fought General Cornwallis and his entire army to a virtual standstill. The tall and elegant Davey was said to have killed more men with his sword than any other American officer in the Revolution. The most unlikely partisan leader was Francis Marion.
He was 48 years old when he finally got a chance to really show his stuff. He wasn't a military man by background, and he had congenital problems with his knees and his ankles. He didn't even look like he was physically capable of being an officer running around in the field.
For 8 months, the survival of the revolution in South Carolina largely depended on Francis Marion and his Phantom Army. Marion had grown up hunting in the woods and swamps. He knew the value of silence, decoy, and ambush, He'd ride 60 miles in one night to make a surprise attack and then melt away before daylight.
Marion never encamped over 2 nights in one place, unless at a safe distance from the enemy. He generally commenced the march about sunset, advancing through the sable curtains of the night, unobserved. Captain Tarleton Brown.
He led only a small band of men at any one time, some white, some black, and all of them poor, with makeshift arms ranging from ancient muskets to short swords made from saws. Always the commander, Marion himself never fought. His sword was even rusted into its scabbard. But his troops bled the British without mercy. Cornwallis became so desperate to stop him that he finally sent Banastre Tarleton to hunt him down. After tracking Marion through 26 miles of swamp, even the indomitable Tarleton gave up.
Come, my boys, let us go back. As for this damned old fox, the devil himself could not catch him.
The epithet caught on. Francis Marion became known as the Swamp Fox. In the end, partisan leaders like Marion reinvented American warfare.
They came along and they took advantage of the geography and the tactics, and they knew that controlling territory was not as important as getting at your enemy and getting at him in a way that you could really hurt him. And it became a model for future wars.
In 1780, most of the battles in the South were fought between Americans, rebel versus loyalist, brother against brother. Simmering resentments boiled over into full-fledged civil war.
Such scenes of devastation, bloodshed and deliberate murder I never was a witness to before. The two opposite principles have set the people of this country to cutting each other's throats.
Neighbor was against neighbor. Father against son. And son against father. And he that would not thrust his own blade through his brother's heart was called villain.
The Civil War builds up because of the intensity of the passions, and it will start getting away from the soldiers and start getting into the hands of the locals. And this is where you get into Hatfield and McCoy type situations. It becomes personal. They're not fighting about king and country anymore. They're not fighting about ideals about liberty. This is revenge. You shot my brother, I'll shoot your brother.
Southern loyalists had years of patriot oppression to avenge. For refusing to renounce the king, they had been fined and jailed. Their property had been confiscated. They'd been executed. Newspapers had even printed recipes for the proper method of tarring and feathering loyalists.
First, strip a person naked. Then heat the tar until it is thin. Pour it upon the naked flesh. Sprinkle with as many feathers as will stick to it. Then hold a lighted candle to the feathers.
Now, with the British behind them, the Loyalists were eager to settle old scores. Their vengeance was described by the rebel governor of South Carolina, John Rutledge.
The enemy have burnt a prodigious number of houses and turned a vast many women, with their children, almost naked into the woods. They seemed determined to break every man's spirit.
The year 1780 in the South and North alike would be remembered as the Dark Days.
He who increases his wealth in such times as the present must be an enemy to his country, be his pretensions what they may. Congressman William Whipple.
Since Benedict Arnold had come to Philadelphia as military commandant, the hero of Saratoga had turned his talents to increasing his wealth.
Benedict Arnold is, I think, in the Revolution, one of the most amazingly interesting figures, because he reflected, I think, most profoundly what you might call the split soul of the American population at that time. He was totally dedicated to in his commitment to the revolutionary cause, but had a boundless ambition for the honor and the acclaim that comes with war, and perhaps the riches as well.
Arnold had been a wealthy man when he left Connecticut to fight the British 5 years before. He always insisted on fine uniforms for himself and his men. He personally advanced money to pay for his expeditions, and Congress never repaid him. As commandant, he lavishly entertained the highest society in Philadelphia and fell in love with one of its most celebrated beauties, Peggy Shippen, the charming daughter of a loyalist judge. At 39, Arnold was nearly twice her age. He cut a dashing figure and had a gallant reputation, but he had little else to offer. His left leg was so badly injured from war wounds that he had to lean on an orderly during his wedding. His soldier's salary paid little. To support the couple's extravagant lifestyle, Arnold began to speculate in goods made scarce by the war: sugar, textiles, tea. In the spring of 1779, the state of Pennsylvania formally charged him with using his position to profiteer. Congress convicted Arnold on a lesser charge of abusing the public trust and ordered the commander-in-chief to reprimand him. Months later, Washington, his old friend and mentor, reluctantly sent the letter. Arnold wrote a hot-tempered reply.
Having made every sacrifice of fortune and blood, and become a cripple in the service of my country, I'd little expected to meet the ungrateful returns I have received from my countrymen. Benedict Arnold.
But Arnold was guilty of all the charges against him and more. The same week he sent his indignant letter to Washington, he began to negotiate with the enemy. Bypassed for promotion, contemptuous of Congress, and deeply in debt, Arnold had decided to turn his coat. His go-between with the British was the commander-in-chief's personal adjutant. Major John Andre was an elegant young officer, a gifted artist, and a poet. He was also an old suitor of Peggy Shippen Arnold.
Peggy Shippen maintains good relations with her boyfriend, John Andre, and through her good offices, Andre and Arnold are put into direct touch with each other and to begin to negotiate to deliver this key new fortification that Washington has been constructing since 1777 at West Point and prepare to surrender it to the British.
West Point commanded the Hudson River, a key defensive line for the colonies. For the British, it seemed the key to finally dividing and conquering America. Arnold had asked to be put in charge of West Point. Washington granted the request. For the delivery of the fortress, Arnold asked for a general's commission in the British Army. He also demanded the lavish sum of 10,000 pounds sterling, 200 times more than a laborer earned in a year. On the night of September 21st, Arnold and Major Andre rendezvoused in a forest on the banks of the Hudson. Arnold gave Andre the plans of West Point and signed a pass that would allow him to travel through American lines. Disguised in civilian clothes, Major Andre was making his way back to New York City when he was waylaid by 3 militiamen bent on robbing him. They discovered the fort's plans hidden in his boot. Word of the spy's capture was sent to the American commander, Benedict Arnold. That morning, Arnold also learned that he had a house guest arriving. General George Washington was coming to tour his prized stronghold at West Point on that very day. When he arrived, Washington was offended that his host wasn't there to greet him. That afternoon, the commander-in-chief read the day's messages.
My God, Arnold has gone over to the British. Whom can we trust?
Benedict's wife, Peggy, who I think was probably the brains of the operation, because I think she was a lot smarter than Benedict was, covers his retreat by feigning a seizure, allowing her nightgown to strategically come open at the right moment to discombobulate Washington and the rest of the command group into, oh my God, and they give her time to collect herself.
Peggy Arnold's hysterics convinced the commander-in-chief that at least she was innocent of treason. By then, her husband, the man Washington once looked on as a son, had already reached safe haven aboard a British warship, the Vulture. Major Andre was left to face Washington's wrath alone. He calmly admitted to being a spy, but refused to name his accomplice.
He is tried in New Jersey. He is condemned to die as a spy. Since he was caught in civilian clothes, much to his disgust, that death is to be by hanging, and he is a person of somewhat aristocratic upbringing. He believes that hanging is the death of a common criminal and that honorable soldiers die by execution, by being shot.
With the words, "It will be but a momentary pang," the 29-year-old Andre tied his own blindfold and slipped the noose over his own head. He was then offered a last word.
He raised the handkerchief from his eyes and said, "I pray you to bear me witness that I meet my fate like a brave man." The wagon removed from under him, he was suspended and instantly expired. The spot was consecrated by the tears of thousands. Dr. James Thatcher.
Most Americans believed the wrong man had been executed, that Andre had paid with his life for Arnold's treason. The British had tried to bribe other generals, John Sullivan, Ethan Allen, Daniel Morgan. Not one had turned. Benedict Arnold, hero of Quebec, of Ticonderoga, of Saratoga, became the most hated man in America.
When Arnold betrays America, the reaction within the Army is extremely venomous, and it's one of those wild mood swings that you can only understand if you know how deeply he was admired.
Within 2 months, Benedict Arnold was wearing the uniform of a British general. Less than a year after his treason, he would lead a raid against New London, Connecticut, just 12 miles from his boyhood home. By 1780, half of Americans were neither patriot nor loyalist. They were known as trimmers, drifting to whichever side the winds of war might blow them. Into this sea of vacillation plunged one of Cornwallis's most dependable commanders. Major Patrick Bulldog Ferguson was determined to recruit every fence-sitter in the Carolinas.
If you wish to be robbed, murdered, and see your wives and daughters abused by the dregs of mankind, say so at once, and let your women turn their backs on you and look for real men to protect them.
Major Ferguson, the same marksman who spared George Washington at the Battle of Brandywine, inflamed the countryside with tales of rebel atrocities. He soon gathered 1,100 men, all of them American. His loyalists, dressed in bright red, learned the bayonet and prepared to fight their neighbors to the death. Ferguson threw down a gauntlet to the rebels across the Blue Ridge Mountains. Unless they put down their arms, he would march his army over the mountains, hang their leaders, and, as he put it, lay their country waste with fire and sword.
The word gets out through the rumor mill that Ferguson is going to come out and attack the over-the-mountain settlements. This rumor produces an instantaneous reaction amongst the over-mountain men. We won't let him come to us, we'll go get him. Everybody jumps on their horses, grabs their rifles, and off they head, organizing as they go along, drawing in people from Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina.
On October 6th, Ferguson chose to make a stand on a heavily wooded hill in North Carolina called Kings Mountain. There, he defied God Almighty and all the rebels out of hell to overcome him. The next day, those rebels arrived, nearly 1,000 hunters and farmers carrying their long rifles. The men were dead shots with their famous frontier weapons, to which they gave names like Hot Lead and Sweet Lips. Smoothly and silently, the rebels moved into position. By the time Ferguson's pickets spotted them, they had the mountains surrounded. A rebel colonel yelled, "Here they are, boys, shout like hell and fight like devils." The riflemen took cover and filled the air with their bullets.
I recollect I stood behind one tree and fired until the bark was nearly all knocked off. One fella shaved me pretty close, for his bullet took a piece out of my own gun stock. Thomas Young, 16 years old.
The Loyalists soon discovered the disadvantage of holding the high ground. Their bullets were sailing over the heads of their targets. Ferguson's position was hopeless. Still, he rode up and down, shouting that he would never surrender to such banditti. Whenever a man tried to raise a white flag, he cut it down. At last, an hour into the battle, even Ferguson saw he was finished. He signaled a few of his officers to follow him in an escape. But a local boy had alerted the rebels that Ferguson, the only British soldier on the field, was wearing a plaid shirt to hide his uniform.
It appeared that almost 50 rifles must have been leveled at him. 7 rifle balls passed through his body. Both of his arms were broken, and his hat and clothing were literally shot to pieces. Private James P. Collins.
Ferguson's second in command called for quarter. The chilling reply was Tarleton's quarter, shouted by rebels who remembered the massacre of their kinsmen under a white flag. Some of the other backwoodsmen didn't know a white flag meant surrender and kept on shooting. At the end of the day, 700 Loyalists were taken prisoner. More than 150 lay dead. An equal number were so badly wounded they were left where they fell. By then it was too dark to descend the mountain. Captors and captives shared a sleepless night.
The situation of the poor Tories appeared to be pitiable. The dead lay in heaps on all sides, while the groans of the wounded were heard in every direction. I could not help turning away from the scene before me with horror, and could not refrain from shedding tears. Private James Collins.
The next day, Loyalist families began arriving at Kings Mountain to look for their men. Many of those still alive were past help. Many who were dead had hardly been buried.
It was badly done. They were thrown into convenient piles and covered with old logs, yet not so as to secure them from becoming a prey to the beasts of the forest or the vultures of the air. Private James P. Collins.
As the news of Kings Mountain spread, Southern Tories began to lay down their guns.
It was no longer safe to be a Loyalist on the frontiers. They became dejected and timid. The Loyalist was no longer safe to sleep in his own house. He hid himself in the swamps. Loyalist Colonel Robert Gray.
1780, a year that began with despair for the rebels, had ended with a glimmer of hope. The British stranglehold on the South was weakening. Despite inflation, treason, and Charleston, the Patriots' worst defeat of the war, the Revolution was still alive. Before the next year would end, the fate of America would be decided in a showdown near a quiet Virginia settlement called Yorktown.
Likewise, I'll sell my spirit.